food. Okay, so talk about the skull. And I've got some pictures from the textbook, some pictures of actual bones from our lab. And so hopefully between these two and these pictures and the YouTube videos, you'll have a good idea of how to identify bones and their features. Remember to get your lab guide printed out as you go along with the bones. You want to learn the bones and only the features that are mentioned in the lab guide. So as we go along today, I'm going to try to cover those as I talk. Again, in case you didn't do this before, when I talked about it in the intro, don't forget to go to Bio Digital Human. If you haven't done so already, it's free. You can use it in Chrome. Great way to look at the bones. I just love it. I think it's really cool. There's something called Visible Body as well, but you have to pay for that. It's really cool. Dr. Ansardi uses it, but again, this one's free. So if you're like me, you like free, you might want to try it. Okay, so let's get started on our lab video, the skull. And I'll use blue today. Okay, so this is a picture of the skull from your textbook. And one of the things I want to point out to you before we move on is when you're looking in your textbook, you're going to notice that there's all these cartoons of the skull and of your bones. What I like about your textbook is it picks a color for a bone, and it uses that same color throughout the textbook. So if you're looking at a picture of the skull in this direction, you see this green bone. That's going to be the parietal bone. If you turn the page and another picture has it from another view or upside down or whatever view that they're looking at, and you see that green bone, it's still the parietal bone. So it helps you kind of get a 3D image of these bones, because you've got to think about these bones from more than one angle. You've got to think about these bones from looking at the outside. If you were inside the skull vault looking around the inside, you've got to think about what it looks like if you're looking up to the skull this way, looking at the skull this way. So I like your textbook because it's color coordinated, so that kind of helps you get that 3D image. So this is kind of a picture from your textbook, and just ignore these arrows here. I couldn't make them go away. And you can see you've got these color coordinated bones, and this is a real skull. So you need to be able to take these pictures from your textbook and then look at a real skull, pictures of the skull in your book, and be able to identify those bones. Because what you're going to see on the lab practical is not going to be this. You're going to see the actual skulls. Okay, so you want to learn to be able to recognize the bones on the skulls, on the models. Again, you want to recognize these bones not only from the front side, like this, looking at the face, but also from the side or even underneath. So think about these bones in 3 dimensions. And again, if you go to Bio Digital Human, you can turn that bone, the skull, around. And you can also, there's several YouTube videos. You're welcome to go, and I've got a few of those in Blackboard for you to look at as well to kind of think about the skull in 3D. All right, so let's start talking about the bones of the actual skull. When we talk about the skull bones, we actually divide it into 2 categories. And the first one is the cranium, and the second is the facial bones. The cranium is the bones that surround the brain. So the bones that make up the cranial cavity. The facial bones are these bones that are kind of in front, anterior to the cranium, and make up your face, your facial bones. And so we're going to start talking about the bones in the cranium and then move to the facial bones. Again, when we talk about these bones, I want you to think about how you would look at these bones on the inside. On this picture, we have basically made a cut here, and we're looking inside the cranial cavity, inside that cranial vault. All right, and you can see the brain fits nicely inside that cranial cavity. So you've got to think about the brain, the skull from the outside and also the inside. This is a cut. You can kind of look at the skull from a coronal cut, and you can see the cavities. Here's your cranial cavity, your orbital cavities, your oral cavities, and a lot of this stuff here. This is all like sinuses, the spaces inside your cranium. So again, you've got to just start thinking about this skull in 3D. And I wish you guys had a skull at home, but you don't. So just think about it. If you could have one, turn it around and look at it from all angles. You can take the cranium off, take the skull cap off, look at the inside. Again, those YouTube videos are helpful because you can see Ms. Graham kind of turning everything around, and you can see it from different angles. Alright, let's move on. So if you look at your lab guide, the first page, it talks about your fontanelles and your sutures. I'm going to do fontanelles at the end. It makes it a little easier to learn fontanelles at the end, but we will go ahead and do the sutures. And what's a suture? If you have surgery and they do sutures, what's that doing? It's kind of holding you together. That's what sutures are. They are basically the lines where the joints, where the two bones or where any bone in the skull comes together. So these little sutures are basically the joints between skull bones. And we have 4 major sutures. There's a bunch of different sutures, but you're only responsible for knowing the 4 major ones. You have the coronal suture. And the coronal suture, think about the frontal or coronal plane, is this suture here and here. So basically it's right across the top of your head, going across this way. You have the sagittal suture, and what did we say sagittal was? Sagittal is when you divide someone left and right. So your sagittal suture goes right down the midline, along the top of your head. You have the lambdoid suture, and it's on the back of your head, and it comes around here. And you have the squamosal suture. And if you remember your tissue types, we talked about simple or stratified squamosal cells. Squamous kind of means squished, irregular, so this is your squamosal suture. Now what you want to pay attention to is which bones these sutures are holding together. So for example, your coronal suture is connecting your frontal bone to your parietal bone. Here's your frontal bone, and you have 2 parietal bones. So this suture connects your frontal and parietal bones together. Your sagittal suture connects your 2 parietal bones together. Your lambdoid suture, which is right here, and right here, connects your occipital bone to your parietal bone. And then your squamosal suture, this is your temporal bone. It connects your temporal bone to your parietal bone. This is your sphenoid bone. So just take a look at your textbook and make sure you understand which bones these sutures are connecting. Again, you have other sutures. Anywhere you see these little yellow lines, these are all sutures. You only have to know these 4 main ones. Okay, so let's start with the cranial bones. And you have 8 cranial bones. You have 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones on either side, 1 occipital bone, 2 temporal bones, one on either side, a sphenoid bone, and an ethmoid bone. This is your frontal bone. This is your parietal bone, and there's one on the other side. Your occipital bone, back of your head. You have a temporal bone on this side, and then one on the other side. The sphenoid bone is kind of inside the skull, but you actually can see part of it here. This is the sphenoid bone. And then you have the ethmoid bone. And ethmoid bone, again, it's a bone also that's kind of inside the skull, but you can see a little bit of it right here, this little orange bone. Right here. So those are the bones that make up the cranium. All these bones fuse together and make the vault that your brain sits inside of, inside your cranium. So we're going to go through each one of these bones and talk about specific features for these bones. Again, here's your sutures. Coronal suture, squamosal suture, lambdoid suture, and then your sagittal suture would be right here between your parietal bones. So here's your skull. So remember, we're going to have to identify these things on an actual skull. So where's the frontal bone? Here. Here's your parietal bone. Your occipital bone is going to be back here. This is your temporal bone, right here. This is your sphenoid bone. And then your ethmoid bone is going to be right in there. Here's your suture, squamosal suture. Your lambdoid suture is going to be back here. Your coronal suture. So just like I said, make sure you're paying attention to what they look like on the actual bones. You also need to think about what would happen if I was to make a sagittal cut inside the skeleton, inside the cranial, inside the skull. How would you identify those bones from the inside? The same bones, you can see the bones from the outside and the inside. So this is basically a sagittal cut so that you can see Here's your frontal bone here. Here's the parietal bone. You can see the occipital bone is a very big bone. It goes all the way up and underneath the skull. Your temporal bone is here. One thing to remember about parietal, if you remember it from Unit 1, parietal is like you talked about your parietal pleura, your membranes that surround your lung cavity. Parietal means wall. So your parietal bones basically form the wall, kind of these big walls of your cranial cavity. Your occipital bone is in the occipital region. It's a really big, thick bone. You can see how thick it is right here. If you're going to fall and hit your head, it's a lot better to fall and hit your head right here than it is on the front of your head. This is kind of thin compared to this part of your head. It's nice and protected. You can see this is the frontal bone here. There's a little suture line here. Parietal bone. It's hard to see the lambdoid suture, but it's right around here. All this is occipital bone. So I just want you to make sure that you're paying attention to these bones in 3D. Also, all these bones that I'm talking about, the frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, these are all flat bones. So hopefully you remember and go back. If you don't remember, flat bones are made by which kind of process? Intermembranous? Anyone? Go back and check it out if you don't remember. That's something you need to know. Alright, so let's talk about some of the features of the frontal bone. So the frontal bone is the bone that we call our forehead, basically. And on the frontal bone, it comes all the way. If you look in the orbit of your eye, the orbit of your eye is not just one bone. It's made up of a bunch of different bones that come together to make the orbit of the eye. The frontal bone comes all the way around here. So this whole thing is the frontal bone. And the two features you need to know are the supraorbital margins, and basically that's kind of your brow line, this ridge here, and here, and then you have these little notches. So that's your supraorbital margin with notch. You also have some sinuses that you can't see on this particular picture, but inside this area there's some little hollowed out spaces or sinuses inside your frontal bone. So if you've ever had a sinus headache, you kind of feel it in here, that's some little basically sinus or open areas inside your frontal bone. And one of the reasons we have sinuses is to allow us to have a little bit of lightness to our bone. You don't want a big old solid bone everywhere because your head would be too heavy, you wouldn't be able to hold it up. So we have sinuses to kind of lighten the load, make our skull not so heavy. On the parietal bone, there's really not any features, you just need to be able to recognize. Here's one parietal bone. Here's the other parietal bone. This is the parietal bone. And there's really no special features about the parietal bones. You have two, one on either side. The occipital bone, really big, nice, thick bone. It comes all, here's a lambdoid suture, right here. And if you're wondering why it's called the lambdoid suture, the letter the lambda, you may have seen that in mathematics. This looks like an upside down Y. So the lambdoid suture makes that upside down Y. So here's your lambdoid suture. So this brown bone is the occipital bone. And the occipital bone comes all the way around through here. And the features that you need to know on the occipital bone are the foramen magnum. Whenever you see the word foramen, that means hole. And so there's all kind of foramen, and these holes are for places for nerves to go through, vessels to go through, blood vessels, whatever. There's got to be a way for things to get through the bone, and so we call the holes foramen. So the foramen magnum, magnum means big, so the foramen magnum is the big hole. And it's basically the hole that your spinal cord exits the brain and goes into your spinal column. So this is where your spinal cord comes out of your skull. The other features are the occipital condyles. You see the word condyle, that means rocker. So right here, there's one here and one here, your occipital condyles. So if you look at a skull, I've got one right here, so here's my foramen magnum. On either side of the foramen magnum are these two little humps, these little bulges. And basically what happens is it allows your skull to sit on top of your top vertebra and rock. So you can move this, you can say yes, make this movement. So your occipital condyles allow your head to rock and make the yes motion. Your next bone is the sphenoid bone, and it's kind of a bat-shaped bone, and basically it's kind of a deep bone inside your skull, and you can see it from several different angles. This is one that's been disarticulated or separated out from all the other bones so that you can see what it looks like here and here. Well, if you were to take this and put it here, you see it looks like a bat. There's also a little bat shape here. Well, this is the sphenoid bone. So that's what you're looking at, the sphenoid bone inside, when you're looking down inside the cranial cavity, cranial vault of the skull. So here's your sphenoid bone, and you can see it here and here. Here's your sphenoid bone. If you go back to a full skull, and you go back to a picture, hang on, you can also see it coming here. This is your sphenoid bone. We have some features about the sphenoid bone with the greater and lesser wings of the sphenoid. Think about the bat. You've got some little wings here, some little wings here. These are your lesser wings. These are your greater wings. And you can see that in the skull, these are the lesser wings here and here. And then here are your greater wings. And you can see it again. If you look back at that picture, these are your greater wings. Now, another place you can see the sphenoid bone is inside the orbit of the eye. You see this evil eye? If you look inside the skull, you see these little slits here. The bone that makes up this evil eye, these are the two wings of the sphenoid bone, and between those two wings is the slit. So that little evil eye that you see when you're looking into the skull, that's the sphenoid bone. So remember, you've got to think about how you can identify that bone from any angle. You also have what's called the sella turcica. Sella turcica. And that means Turkish saddle. And this is this area right here. This little pit right here is called the sella turcica. And this is basically a little hole, a little seat for your pituitary. So your pituitary hangs off the brain and it has its own little place to be nice and comfy and safe inside the sella turcica. You have the optic foramina. And the optic foramina, remember, a foramen is just a hole, and the optic foramina are these holes here that allow the optic nerve to come from the orbit of the eye into the cranial cavity. So let me go back to the front again. Right here, there's a little foramina right here, and you can't, I've got another picture I'll show you in a minute, here and here. Here's where the optic nerve leaves. Here's the eye would be sitting here. The optic nerve would be coming off here and going through these optic foramina. Let's see, I've got a better picture. Let me find it. Hang on. I think I do. Here we go. Whoops. So right here, so here's that, the slit, that evil eye. Right here is a circle, the little hole, the optic foramina. That's where your optic nerve leaves your orbital cavity and goes into your brain. Let me go back. Sorry about that. I need to put that picture somewhere else. Okay, so that's your sphenoid bone. And you also have some sphenoid sinuses. If you'll look, there's some kind of open spaces inside the sphenoid bone. Again, that gives it lightness inside that part of the cranial cavity. That bone's not so heavy. It's really a delicate bone. The next bone is the ethmoid bone. Again, it's a deep bone that's kind of buried inside the skull. Here's your sphenoid bone again. Well, the ethmoid bone is right anterior to that, and this little area right here is called your ethmoid bone. If you look at the book, you'll also see this bone here. That's the ethmoid bone. And this top part of the inside of the nose is the ethmoid bone. So all those, you have to think about how many different ways you see the ethmoid bone. So you can see it here, you can see it here, and if you were to look at a cross-section, you would be able to see it right there. Some parts of the ethmoid bone are the crista galli and the caribriform plate. Let me write that down, crista galli. And that means rooster's comb, and this little ridge right here, that's the crista galli, and it's basically an attachment point. And then around the crista galli is called the caribriform. cribriform plate, and it's a little perforated. There's actually little holes inside the cribriform plate that allow the nerves from the olfactory nerve, your smell nerve, to go down into your nasal cavity so that you can smell. So that's your cristogalli and your cribriform plate. They're part of the ethmoid bone. This perpendicular plate is part of your nasal septum. That's part of the ethmoid bone. And then you have what are called the nasal conchae. Let me write that one down. And nasal conchae, they're your turbinate bones. Now, a turbine is something that spins. So if you look at these little curve-shaped bones, these are your turbinate bones, and you have 6 of them, or 3 on each side. There's actually 2 that are way up here. Well, these 2 bones, your superior and your medial nasal conchae or turbinate bones are part of the ethmoid bone. So when you breathe in, that actually causes the air to swirl so it can be warmed and moisturized before it goes into your lungs. Also, it gives the mucus and the hair a chance to catch any dust that needs to be caught. You have a third set called your inferior nasal conchae, and they're down here. They're not part of the ethmoid bone. So your medial and superior are part of the ethmoid bone, your perpendicular plate, cribriform plate, and your cristogalli. Alright, the next bone is your temporal bone, and these bones that are on either side of your head, this is a disarticulated one, so you can kind of see what the shape of it is. So all this here is your temporal bone. Some features that you need to know about the temporal bone. You have the zygomatic process. So what makes our cheekbones? This is the zygomatic bone, right here. This is your zygomatic bone. And it connects to the zygomatic process, this long arm that sticks off the temporal bone. These 2 join together to make the zygomatic arch, which makes our cheekbones. So this is your zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So on a test, I might say, name this bone. You would say temporal bone. Name this feature, the zygomatic process. Okay, it's not the zygomatic arch, it's not the zygomatic bone, it's the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, so make sure you see that distinction. You have the mandibular fossa. I'll get to that in just a second. Styloid process. Hanging off the bottom of the temporal bone, there's this little sharp object called the styloid process. It's an attachment point. You have the mastoid process, which is this big, rounded area right here. You actually feel it right behind your ear. This bump is your mastoid process. And you have several foramina. You also have a hole. There's basically got to be a way for sound to get inside your skull, so this is called the external auditory meatus. If you see the word meatus, that means canal, not meatus, it's meatus. So acoustic means sound, so the external ear hole is your external acoustic meatus. So let's look on the bottom side of the temporal bone. Kind of flip the skull over, look under the bottom side and see the rest of these features. So here's the temporal bone, it kind of comes around, kind of like that. There's your zygomatic process. The mandibular fossa are right here on either side. And let me go to a picture. Where your mandibles, let's see what, where your lower jawbone, your mandibles, and your skull connect, where these 2 connect and allows you, whoops, that's backwards. Where your mandible connects, these little ditches here, these are called the mandibular fossa. Let me go back. So a fossa means a ditch. Basically, so think about a place where you can, a depression. So your mandible fits in that mandibular fossa so that you can open and close your mouth. You have the styloid process. Again, these little sharp points here. You can see them here and here. See them a little better. Right here. And you also have some jugular and carotid foramen. Again, a foramen just means a hole. The carotid foramen is the one that your carotid artery goes up and down between your skull and your cervical, between your neck. And your jugular foramen is how your jugular vein gets from the inside of the head back out. So you just look for your jugular foramen and your carotid canal or carotid foramina. Alright, so that's all. Oh, there's one more thing about the temporal bone. Remember, you've got this meatus, which is basically how the sound gets in. Well, inside this, your ear canal, you have some ear bones called the ossicles. And the three ossicles are your malleus, your incus, and your stapes. And those are the three bones inside the ear that kind of vibrate together to transmit sound. And we'll talk about that in Unit 5, in the nervous system. But those are also incorporated into your temporal bone. They're not actually connected. They're just kind of inside that part of the cranium. Let's see. I think that's all there is on the temporal bone. Okay, so I'm going to take a break here and make the next video to be just the facial bones because it's getting kind of long, and I'm going to give you guys a chance to take a break, make a new video, and we'll do just the bones of the face.